I learned something important about people after turning 72. If you want to know what someone truly thinks of you, do not tell them how much money you have. 3 months before I moved into my son's house, I inherited $27 million. Even now, saying that number feels unreal. I was not a business owner. I was not a celebrity. I was a retired schoolteacher from North Carolina who spent most of her life clipping coupons and waiting for department stores to announce holiday sales. The inheritance came from a distant relative I barely knew growing up. The legal process took nearly a year to complete, and when everything was finalized, my attorney, William Carter, sat across from me and slid a folder across his desk. "Margaret," he said, "your life is about to become very different." The strange thing was that I did not want my life to become different. My husband had passed away 4 years earlier. My house felt too large for one person. The stairs seemed steeper every winter. The silence lasted longer every evening. More than anything, I missed having family nearby. That was why I accepted my son Daniel's invitation when he suggested I move into their home. "You should not be alone," he told me. "We have plenty of room." It sounded reasonable. Loving even. What Daniel did not know was that by the time I packed my belongings, every dollar of that inheritance had already been placed into protected accounts managed by professionals. The money was safe. The only people who knew about it were William, myself, and one financial advisor bound by confidentiality agreements. Not even my closest friend knew. Certainly not my family. On a warm Saturday morning, I loaded the last few boxes into a moving truck and drove to Daniel's house. His wife Rachel greeted me at the door with a smile. The grandchildren ran through the living room laughing. Everything looked perfect. Daniel carried my suitcase upstairs and showed me where I would be staying. "We fixed up the guest room for you," he said proudly. I followed him down the hallway. Then I saw it. The guest room was not really a guest room anymore. It was a small converted storage room at the far end of the house. A narrow bed sat against one wall. Several old boxes remained stacked in the corner. The single window faced a fence less than 10 feet away. I smiled anyway. "It is lovely," I said. Daniel seemed relieved. Rachel nodded politely before returning downstairs. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I sat alone on the edge of the bed looking around the tiny room. For the first time, I wondered whether moving in had been the right decision. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from William. "Just checking in. Remember, nobody knows about the inheritance unless you choose to tell them." I stared at the screen for several seconds before typing a reply. "They do not need to know." "Not yet." I placed the phone on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. In the darkness, I made a decision. For a while, I would simply watch. I would listen. I would learn who valued me when they believed I had nothing more to offer than my company. I had no idea that decision was about to reveal far more than I expected. The first week passed quietly. I made breakfast most mornings, folded laundry when nobody asked me to, and picked up the grandchildren from school twice when schedules became complicated. On the surface, everything seemed pleasant. Daniel left for work early and returned home tired. Rachel managed the household with impressive efficiency. The children were energetic, polite, and constantly moving from one activity to another. I told myself I was lucky to be surrounded by family. Yet small details began catching my attention. They were not dramatic enough to create an argument. Not important enough to mention. Just little things that slowly accumulated in the back of my mind. One evening, while helping clear the dinner table, I overheard Rachel speaking to a friend on the phone in the next room. "Things are tighter than ever," she said. "Between the mortgage, the car payments, and everything else, I feel like we are barely keeping up." There was nothing unusual about that. Many families face financial pressure. What caught my attention came a few moments later. "At least Daniel's mother moved in," she continued. "Otherwise, she would probably be spending money on a place of her own." The statement was not cruel. Not exactly. But it lingered with me longer than it should have. A few days later, Rachel asked if I could start contributing more toward groceries. Again, the request seemed reasonable. I immediately agreed. Then she handed me a list she had prepared. The amount surprised me. Not because I could not afford it, but because it exceeded what one additional person would realistically consume. I paid it without complaint. After all, I was living under their roof. Still, I noticed how quickly financial topics seemed to appear whenever Rachel and I spoke privately. Another week passed. One afternoon, I returned from a walk and entered through the garage. As I stepped into the kitchen, I heard my name. The conversation stopped instantly when they noticed me. Daniel smiled awkwardly. Rachel busied herself organizing mail. I pretended not to notice. But that evening, lying awake in my small room, I found myself thinking about the silence that followed my arrival. Silence often says more than words. Around that same time, William called to check on me. We spoke briefly about routine financial matters. Before ending the conversation, he asked whether I had reconsidered telling my family about the inheritance. Not yet, I replied. Why not? He asked gently. I looked around the tiny room, the narrow bed, the storage boxes, the single lamp. Because I am still learning. He laughed softly. Learning what? I paused before answering. Whether people treat me differently when they think I have nothing. The following weekend, Rachel invited several neighbors over for a barbecue. During the gathering, introductions were made. One woman smiled and asked whether I had recently sold my house. Before I could answer, Rachel responded for me. Yes, but there was not much left after expenses. She is basically retired and living with us now. Her tone sounded casual. Nobody questioned it. The conversation moved on. Yet I stood there wondering why she felt comfortable speaking about my finances at all. That night, as I prepared for bed, I opened a notebook I had packed months earlier. On the first page, I wrote a single sentence. People reveal themselves when they believe there is nothing to gain. Then I closed the notebook and turned off the light. I had a feeling I would be adding many more pages before this story was over. About 3 weeks after moving in, I discovered that houses have their own rhythms. You learn when people wake up, when they relax, and when they think nobody is paying attention. One Thursday evening, I experienced one of those moments entirely by accident. I had gone downstairs around 10 o'clock to get a glass of water. The kitchen lights were off, but voices drifted from the family room. Daniel and Rachel were talking quietly. I had no intention of listening. In fact, I nearly turned around and went back upstairs. Then I heard my name. Instinct stopped me. I am just saying we need to think long term, Rachel said. Your mother cannot stay in that room forever. Daniel sighed. What exactly are you suggesting? I am suggesting we need a plan. There was nothing offensive about the words themselves. Families make plans all the time. Yet something in her tone made me pause. She sold her house, Rachel continued. Eventually that money will run out. Then what? I stood silently in the dark kitchen. Daniel responded almost immediately. Mom has always managed her finances. That is not the point, Rachel said. The point is that we have our own future to think about. A few moments later, I heard footsteps and quietly returned upstairs before anyone noticed I had been there. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The conversation replayed itself in my mind. What struck me most was not concern about money. It was the assumption. Rachel spoke as though my future had already been calculated. As though my resources were limited and predictable. As though she knew exactly what my situation looked like. The next morning, I opened my notebook again. Beneath the first sentence, I added another. People often reveal their assumptions before they reveal their intentions. Days passed. Life continued normally on the surface. I helped with errands. I attended my granddaughter's school concert. I baked cookies with my grandson on Saturday afternoon. Yet I began noticing other small things. Rachel frequently asked questions about retirement. Not direct questions. Indirect ones. Casual ones. She wondered how expensive healthcare became with age. She asked whether maintaining a house alone had been difficult. She seemed particularly interested in how much property taxes had cost during my final years in my old home. Each question arrived wrapped in friendliness. Each answer appeared to satisfy her. Yet I could not shake the feeling that she was collecting information. One afternoon, while sorting mail on the kitchen counter, she held up an envelope from my bank. Still keeping busy with financial paperwork? She asked with a smile. There is always paperwork, I replied. She laughed politely, but her eyes remained on the envelope a second longer than necessary. That evening, William called again. After discussing a few routine matters, He asked how things were going. I thought carefully before answering. Everyone is being polite, I said. But I am starting to see what they believe my future looks like. And what does it look like? He asked. I glanced around the small room at the end of the hallway. A woman who needs more from them every year. William was quiet for a moment. And they have no idea how wrong they are. I smiled slightly. No, I said. They do not. Then I looked at the notebook resting on my nightstand and realized I had only begun discovering what life in this house was truly going to teach me. By the beginning of the second month, my notebook had become a habit. Every evening before bed, I spent a few minutes writing down observations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing scandalous. Just small moments that revealed how people behaved when they believed nobody was keeping score. One Saturday morning, Rachel stood in the kitchen reviewing household bills. I was preparing coffee when she sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Everything costs more these days, she said. Groceries, insurance, utilities. Sometimes I feel like we are supporting half the world. Daniel barely looked up from his newspaper. We are doing fine. Rachel smiled, but the smile seemed forced. Maybe, but every extra expense adds up. Her eyes briefly shifted toward me before returning to the stack of papers. The glance lasted less than a second. It was enough. I said nothing and continued stirring my coffee. Later that afternoon, I drove to visit my friend Helen. We spent several hours talking on her porch while drinking iced tea. Unlike everyone else in my life, Helen knew nothing about the inheritance. I preferred it that way. Her opinions remained completely unbiased. At one point, she asked how I was adjusting to life with Daniel's family. Everyone is kind, I answered carefully. But, she asked. I laughed softly. You always notice the word that comes after the compliment. Helen smiled. That is because there is usually a reason for it. I thought for a moment before responding. I think some people have already decided who they believe I am. Helen nodded slowly. And who is that? An elderly widow with limited options. The answer felt strange when spoken aloud. Yet it was true. That was the role people seemed to have assigned me. What they did not know was that my future remained entirely in my own hands. The following week, another moment found its way into my notebook. I came downstairs one evening and discovered Rachel browsing retirement community websites on her laptop. She quickly changed the screen when she noticed me. Just helping a coworker research options for her parents, she explained. Her answer arrived so quickly it felt rehearsed. I smiled politely. That was thoughtful of you. Yet later that night I wrote down every detail I could remember. Not because I believed she had done something wrong. Because patterns matter. A single event proves nothing. Multiple events begin telling a story. Around that same time, William called with routine updates. Before ending the conversation, he mentioned that several charitable organizations had contacted his office regarding potential future donations. They are patient, he said. There is no pressure. I looked around my small room and smiled. $27 million sat quietly in protected accounts, while I slept beside old storage boxes and holiday decorations. The contrast amused me more than it should have. Tell them I appreciate their patience, I said. I am still making decisions. And how is your evaluation going? William asked. He knew exactly what I meant. I glanced toward the closed bedroom door. Very well, I replied. People reveal themselves every day. That weekend, something happened that confirmed I was right to remain silent. During a family dinner, Rachel casually suggested converting my room into a home office someday. Not immediately, of course, she added quickly. Just eventually. Daniel looked uncomfortable. I remained calm. But later that night, I opened my notebook and wrote a sentence that stayed with me long after the ink dried. Some people begin planning your departure before they finish welcoming your arrival. About 2.5 months after moving in, William asked a question that stayed with me for days. What exactly are you waiting for? He said during one of our phone calls. I understood what he meant immediately. From a practical standpoint, there was no reason to keep the inheritance secret any longer. The legal work had been completed. The funds were secure. Every document was finalized. Yet I still had not told Daniel or Rachel. I looked out the window toward the backyard where my grandchildren were chasing each other through the grass. I think I am waiting to see who they are when there is nothing to gain, I replied. William was quiet for a moment. And what have you learned so far? I considered the question carefully. That kindness and generosity are not always the same thing. After ending the call, I thought about that distinction for the rest of the afternoon. Daniel was kind. He genuinely wanted me nearby. I never doubted that. Rachel was more complicated. She was polite, helpful when it suited the situation, respectful when other people were watching. Yet beneath the surface, I increasingly sensed a constant calculation taking place. Not greed exactly. Something subtler. A habit of measuring value. One evening, that feeling became much harder to ignore. Rachel asked if we could talk privately. We sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone upstairs. Her tone was friendly, almost concerned. Margaret, she began, have you thought about long-term arrangements? I smiled. What kind of arrangements? She folded her hands neatly. Assisted living communities, retirement residences, things like that. The question did not surprise me. The timing did. I was healthy, independent, still driving, still volunteering twice a month at the local library. There was no practical reason to discuss such things. Not recently, I answered. Rachel nodded slowly. I just think it is important to plan ahead. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Nothing openly unpleasant was said. Yet I could not ignore the fact that she seemed far more interested in my future living arrangements than I was. Later that night, I opened my notebook and recorded every detail. The next entry came only 3 days later. I was walking down the hallway when I heard Rachel speaking with a neighbor who had stopped by unexpectedly. We are doing our best, Rachel said. It is a lot of responsibility having an elderly parent live with you full-time. The statement was technically true. Yet the way she said it created a picture that did not match reality. I contributed financially. I handled my own expenses. I helped around the house whenever possible. Somehow, the story being told sounded very different. That weekend, Helen visited for lunch. As we sat together on the patio, she watched Rachel interact with me for nearly an hour. Afterward, as we prepared to leave for a short walk, Helen leaned closer and lowered her voice. Can I tell you something? She asked. Of course. She hesitated briefly. I think she has already decided what role you are supposed to play in this family. The comment startled me because it matched exactly what I had been feeling for weeks. That evening, I returned to my room and opened the notebook once again. Beneath dozens of observations, I added a new sentence. The most revealing test is not how people treat you when they need you. It is how they treat you when they believe your best years are already behind you. Then I closed the notebook and smiled quietly to myself. Because the person Rachel thought she understood did not actually exist. The moment that finally changed everything arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was no dramatic argument, no raised voices, no shocking confrontation. Instead, it began with a simple conversation that Rachel probably assumed I would never think about twice. I had just returned from volunteering at the library when I found her sitting alone at the kitchen table reviewing household budgets. She smiled as I entered. Busy day, she asked. A good one, I replied. The children at the reading program always make me smile. She nodded politely, then tapped her pen against a spreadsheet. I wish I had time for things like that. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down. For a few minutes we discussed ordinary topics. School schedules, grocery prices, weekend plans. Then she leaned back in her chair and sighed. Sometimes I wonder what retirement will even look like for people my age. I listened quietly. Everything is so expensive now, she continued. You spend your whole life working and still worry about the future. Her concerns sounded genuine. I understood them. Then her tone shifted slightly. At least older generations had time to build something before everything became so complicated. I smiled. Every generation faces challenges. She nodded. True. But some people are fortunate enough to have assets, property, savings, things to pass on. The comment seemed casual. Yet something about it felt intentional. I said nothing. Rachel glanced toward me. Daniel told me your old house sold before you moved in. Yes, I replied. It did. That must have helped. A little. She smiled again. Every little bit matters. The conversation ended there, but the expression on her face stayed with me. It was the same expression I had begun noticing whenever financial topics appeared. Curious, evaluating, measuring. Later that evening, Daniel came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. We ate together and spent nearly an hour laughing about old family stories. Watching him interact with his children reminded me of the boy he once was. Kind, honest, thoughtful. The contrast between Daniel and Rachel continued to grow more noticeable. One seemed motivated by relationships. The other increasingly seemed motivated by outcomes. A few days later, William called with another routine update. Near the end of our conversation, he informed me that several documents related to the inheritance required my final approval. Nothing urgent, he said, but eventually you will need to make long-term decisions. I thanked him and promised to schedule a meeting soon. After hanging up, I sat quietly in my room thinking about the future. For months I had been observing everyone around me, watching, listening, learning. The picture had become surprisingly clear. Then on Friday evening, Rachel made a suggestion that revealed more than she realized. While discussing home improvements, she casually mentioned converting my room into a home office within the next year or two. Of course, she added quickly, that depends on what arrangements you decide to make for yourself. The sentence sounded harmless, yet I understood exactly what it meant. In her mind, my stay here already had an expiration date. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote another observation. Some people stop seeing a person and start seeing a timeline. Then I closed the notebook and smiled quietly. Because for the first time since moving into that house, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. The following Monday, I drove to William's office and made a decision that would quietly change everything. For months, I had observed the people around me. I had listened carefully. I had resisted the temptation to reveal the truth whenever a conversation became uncomfortable. Now I finally understood enough to act. William greeted me warmly and led me into the conference room where several folders waited on the table. You look certain about something, he said. I smiled. I am. He sat across from me and opened a notebook. Tell me what you want to do. For the next 2 hours, we reviewed every major element of my estate plan. Some decisions were easy. Others required careful thought. But by the end of the meeting, one thing was absolutely clear. My plans would reflect character, not assumptions. Actions, not expectations. Relationships, not entitlement. I signed the final documents. I felt surprisingly calm. There was no anger behind the decisions. No desire to punish anyone. I simply wanted my choices to match the reality I had spent months observing. Before I left, William asked whether I intended to reveal the inheritance soon. Yes, I replied. The time is getting close. Do you expect a difficult reaction? He asked. I thought about Rachel. Then I thought about Daniel. I expect an honest one. On the drive home, I stopped at a small bakery and bought cookies for the grandchildren. The simple errand made me smile. $27 million sat safely protected. Yet the highlight of my afternoon was choosing chocolate chip cookies for 2 excited children. Life has a way of reminding us what actually matters. When I arrived home, Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table. Several brochures were spread in front of her. Retirement communities, assisted living facilities, senior housing developments. She quickly gathered them when she saw me enter. Research for a friend's family, she explained. Once again, the explanation arrived before I had even asked a question. That is thoughtful, I replied. Her shoulders relaxed. The pattern had become almost predictable. A few days later, another revealing moment occurred. During dinner, Rachel casually mentioned how expensive college would be for the children. Daniel agreed. The conversation gradually shifted toward long-term financial goals. Investments, savings plans, retirement accounts. Then Rachel said something that caught my attention immediately. Sometimes I wish families helped each other more across generations. The statement sounded harmless. Yet her eyes drifted toward me as she spoke. Daniel continued eating without noticing. I simply smiled. Families help each other in many different ways, I said. Rachel nodded slowly. That is true. The subject changed, but the message remained clear. She was beginning to think more openly about resources. expectations, future possibilities. What she still did not realize was that every assumption she made rested on incomplete information. That weekend, I invited Helen to lunch again. As we sat together, beneath a large oak tree in the park, I finally shared part of the truth. Not the amount, just the existence of the inheritance. Helen stared at me in disbelief. Then she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. You mean to tell me you have been living in a converted storage room while sitting on a fortune? I laughed too. Apparently. Her expression softened. And what have you learned? I looked across the park at families enjoying the afternoon sunshine. Enough to know exactly what comes next. That evening I returned home and found an invitation sitting on my bed. Rachel was planning a large family dinner the following weekend. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone would be there. I stared at the invitation for a long moment before smiling, because she had no idea that the dinner she was organizing was about to become the most unforgettable evening any of them would ever experience. The family dinner took place on a warm Sunday evening. By 6 o'clock, the house was filled with familiar voices, laughter, and the smell of food coming from the kitchen. Relatives I had not seen in months gathered around the dining room and living room. Cousins shared stories. Children ran through the hallway. On the surface, it looked like any ordinary family gathering. Yet I knew something nobody else knew. Before arriving, I had spoken with William one final time. Everything was ready. Every document had been prepared. Every decision had been finalized. All that remained was the truth. Throughout the evening, I watched everyone interact. Daniel moved from group to group, making sure guests felt welcome. The grandchildren proudly showed off school projects. Rachel played the perfect hostess, smiling as she organized food and drinks. If someone had walked into the room, they would have seen a happy family. In many ways, they would have been right. Yet beneath the conversations and laughter, months of observation sat quietly in the back of my mind. Around 7:30, Daniel tapped a glass and thanked everyone for coming. The room gradually settled. Conversations slowed. People turned their attention toward him. Before dessert, he said, smiling, Mom wanted to say a few words. Several heads turned toward me. I stood slowly and smiled. My heart was calm. Surprisingly calm. For months I had imagined this moment. Now it had finally arrived. Thank you all for being here, I began. The past year has brought many changes to my life. Everyone listened attentively. After losing my husband, selling my home and moving in with Daniel's family, I spent a great deal of time thinking about what truly matters. A few people nodded. Rachel smiled politely from across the room. I continued. One lesson became very clear. Character is revealed when people believe there is nothing to gain. The room grew noticeably quieter. Then I reached into my purse and removed a sealed envelope. Several months ago, I received something completely unexpected. Rachel's smile faded slightly. Daniel looked curious. An inheritance. The word immediately changed the atmosphere. Confused expressions appeared around the room. Nobody spoke. I chose not to tell anyone because I wanted to see how life would unfold without that information influencing relationships. I paused briefly. The inheritance totaled $27 million. Silence. Absolute silence. For a moment it seemed as though nobody in the room remembered how to breathe. Rachel stared at me. Daniel blinked repeatedly as if he had misheard the number. Across the room one cousin nearly dropped a fork. I remained calm. The money was never the important part, I said. The important part was what I learned while nobody knew it existed. No one interrupted. No one could. Every face reflected shock. Then I explained that my estate planning had already been completed with professional guidance. Every decision had been made carefully after months of reflection. I did not discuss details yet. That would come later. Instead, I focused on gratitude. I thanked Daniel for welcoming me into his home. I thanked the grandchildren for bringing joy into my life. I thanked family members who had remained supportive through difficult years. When I finally sat down, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then questions erupted from every direction. But among all the reactions, one stood out. Rachel had not said a single word. She simply sat there staring at me as though she had suddenly realized the story she believed she understood had never been the real story at all. The days following that dinner were some of the most revealing of my life. Not because of what people said, but because of how they behaved once the truth was finally known. For months, everyone had interacted with me under one set of assumptions. Now those assumptions were gone. The difference was impossible to miss. Daniel called me the morning after the family gathering. His first words were not about the inheritance. They were about trust. "Mom," he said quietly, "I wish you had told me. I understood." "I know," I replied. "But I needed to understand something first." There was a long pause. Then he asked the question I had expected. "Did you think I would treat you differently?" I smiled sadly. "No, Daniel. I was never testing you. I was observing everyone." By the end of the conversation, I think he understood. Perhaps not completely, but enough. Rachel was different. For nearly a week, she seemed unsure how to speak to me. The confidence she once carried around financial discussions disappeared almost overnight. Conversations became cautious, measured, polite in a way that felt entirely different from before. Yet I did not feel angry toward her. Disappointed at times, certainly. But anger serves very little purpose when the lesson has already been learned. A few days later, William invited me to his office one final time. Together, we reviewed the estate plan I had completed before the family dinner. Every document reflected decisions made during months of observation. No last-minute changes were necessary. No emotional reactions influenced the outcome. The plan remained exactly as I intended. Certain charitable organizations would receive substantial support. Educational opportunities would be funded for future generations. Family members who consistently demonstrated kindness, integrity, and respect would be remembered appropriately. Most importantly, the inheritance would become a tool for creating opportunities rather than expectations. When the meeting ended, William smiled. "Most people use money to control outcomes," he said. "You used it to reveal character." On the drive home, I thought about that statement. He was right. The money had never changed who people were. It simply removed distractions and exposed priorities. Months later, I moved into a beautiful home of my own. Not because I needed luxury, because I wanted independence. The house sat on several quiet acres outside town with a large porch, mature trees, and enough room for family visits whenever they wished to come. The grandchildren loved it immediately. Daniel visited often. We remained close. In many ways, our relationship became even stronger because everything was finally honest. Rachel changed too, though more slowly. To her credit, she eventually acknowledged several difficult truths. Growth is possible when people are willing to face themselves honestly. Whether that growth lasts is something only time can determine. One evening, nearly a year after moving into my new home, I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky shades of gold and orange. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Birds settled into their evening songs. Beside me rested the same notebook I had carried into Daniel's house months earlier. I opened it and turned to the final blank page. Then I wrote one last sentence. "Wealth does not reveal who deserves your trust. Sometimes the absence of wealth does." I closed the notebook and smiled. The inheritance had changed my life in many ways. But the greatest gift was not $27 million. It was clarity. Clarity about family, about character, about myself. And as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I felt something far more valuable than wealth. I felt peace.